and it is my great pleasure to welcome you, both those here in person and the large numbers online, to this year's Sandars Lectures, which are being given by Dr. Timothy Young. Tim is Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Yale Centre for British Art and has published extensively articles, books, essays and reviews, and the most recent publications are the zines 10 Reasons Books Matter, and even better, 10 Reasons Libraries Matter. I'm sensing that most people will agree with those two propositions in this audience. In his previous role as Curator of Modern Books and Manuscripts at the Beinecke Library at Yale, he was particularly responsible for the Betsy Beinecke Shirley collection of American children's literature, and in 2017 published Storytime, which was a collection of essays on the history of children's literature. And for his second lecture this evening, he's speaking on the topic of resistance to bibliography, and he will address a bibliographical conundrum in the history of children's literature. And his full title is Speak, Little Book, an inquiry into publication dates of books for juveniles in the United States and the United Kingdom in the 19th century. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Timothy Young.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. And I just want to reiterate something I said last night, which is that it's an absolute privilege to be here as part of a very long lineage of wonderful bibliographers, librarians, and curators, which include our colleague, Will Noel. The practice of bibliography is an objectifying and well-intentioned set of procedures for inquiry. It assumes one can derive sufficient data about a work from focusing on the physical characteristics and differences between editions and copies of the title of interest. For catalogers and librarians, this has become a dual purpose. The first goal is to distinguish what exactly do you have in hand or want to have in hand. The second goal is to give some information about the context, identity, and the purpose or intended use of a work. Thus, the isness and aboutness we explored in my first lecture yesterday. All of you were very patient then to sit through that largely theory-based talk. Thank you very much. Theory is a great spur for argument and research, which we hope will reveal data in support of a view. And we are well served if that data is repeatable and can be reliably built upon. So today we're going to go looking for some numbers to see if we can recognize patterns of bibliographic data as well as the lack of data. We will be looking at children's literature. How many of you are fans of children's literature? Great. And how many of you actually were children at some time in your lives? None? Oh, 3 or 4, okay. Good, we're off to a great start. We will begin with the question. Why does it seem that so many 19th century children's books are undated? Or more honestly, why does it seem to me that this is a bibliographic situation? Why do I care? I've worked for over 20 years before making my job switch last year with a collection of historical children's literature at Yale at Beinecke Library. It was massively rewarding but challenging because I quickly came to know that one of the core puzzles for researchers of all skills is to determine publications of dates intended for books intended for juvenile audiences. When I understood that, I saw patterns emerge, and one that appeared to be solidly present overall was the rapid disappearance of dates from this category of books, specifically during the 19th century. So then, a plan of research inquiry more formally would be, what percentage of English language publications intended for juvenile audiences published in the 19th century lack imprint dates as part of the publication? Librarians, you will know this, but to clarify what I mean by lack, catalogers and most bibliographers consider publication to carry a date if that information is provided as a component of its title page, title verso, colophon, copyright notice, cover, or certain pages preceding the title page. That comes from cataloging practice, age old. And so on to the process. What I decided to do was to look at sample groups for books for children, published in the UK and the US in the 19th century in 2 libraries. I selected the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, because it holds one of the finest collection of 19th century juvenile imprints. And of course, the Cambridge University Library, as it has a similar wealth of holdings. I chose 3 decades as samples: 1800 to 1809, 1830 to 1839, and 1860 to 1869. You'll see those later in some charts. Important times in changes in publishing in both countries. Then, to add rigor to the process, I chose a control group, drawn from the same libraries for the same 3 decades, specifically novels for adult readers. And to be clear, I do not claim to be a librarian who has done deep dissertation-worthy data analysis. I tend to work across surfaces to see what interesting similarities and trends break through. I have massive respect for my colleagues who do such intensive work and want to keep in mind that any subset or even sliver of the data that I found would be fertile ground for separate narrative histories of bibliographic phenomena and causality. The next step, then, was to gather data on the number of undated books in these defined populations. But wait, how do I go about finding data that is not present? This question points to a larger metaphysical matter. How do we signify absences? I thought, if noting omission of data is important to a specific discipline, that discipline will devise methods for designating omissions. In our profession, librarianship, book history, and cataloging, we have developed a set of symbols. In general, we use these: a dash, an ellipsis, X for the unknown, circa, a blank space, and more specifically, in library and bibliographic work, we use these abbreviations: SD, sine die, ND, no date. Those 2 things are interchangeable depending on when the book was published. SL, sine loco, SN, sine nomine, which could be a place or could be an author, means there's not a name there, and NP for no place. One of the architects of modern cataloging, Charles Ammi Cutter, one-time librarian of the Boston Athenaeum, and the man who gave us our wonderful Cutter numbers, wrote a scintillating 1876 US government printing office manual that includes various suggestions on dating, such as Masonic dates should be followed by the date in the usual form, chronograms should be interpreted and given in Arabic numerals, but more importantly, when the place or date is not given, supply it in brackets if it can be ascertained. If neither is discoverable, write NP or ND to show that the omission of place and date is not an oversight. The bracket, a symbol to rule them all. The uber element that encloses data, if ascertainable, to convey the sense of doubt, conjecture, or correction. It is perhaps the most widely used and fungible of bibliographic symbols. The definition in the OED is compulsory reading. In part, we learned that crotchets or brackets serve to enclose a word or sentence which is to be explained in a note, or the explanation itself, or a word or sentence which is intended, importantly, to supply some deficiency or to rectify some mistake. Additionally, from Collins' dictionary, this is another important piece, adds that the verb form of the bracket can mean to put written or printed material in brackets, especially as being irrelevant, spurious, or bearing a separate relationship of some kind to the rest of the text. While preparing these lectures, I was tempted to switch tracks to focus solely on the history of the bracket. It was so exciting because the etymology of this word, which I will simplify for purposes of this lecture, takes us to realms of fashion, architecture, and power. First, we have braccae, from the Latin from the first centuries of the Common Era, for trousers. Then much later, brug, from France in the 16th century, is also trousers, and the diminutive becomes codpiece. Same time in France in the 16th century, braguettes also as the word for architectural supports. And then what happens? Borrowed into English soon after, braguettes are architectural supports, and then we get brackets, a symbol in writing. What is the lesson here? Demurely put, etymology can reveal connections between patriarchy and bibliography. I have a note here that says hold for laughter, but that's okay. How are brackets used in library work then? Okay. They enclose supplied information, even if it is not exact, such as this circa date, 1828, for the text of the Siege of Belgrade, the comic opera, of course. These are all, by the way, records I'm showing from the wonderfully done and cataloged and written Cambridge University Library. And they may be used to narrow down a range of dates, as with this sheet music, to the popular hit of 1802 or 03 or 04 or 05, On a Hill There Grows a Flower. Now we go down the path demonstrating how librarians handle increasing degrees of doubtfulness by combining dashes with brackets. A religious tract, The Brazen Serpent, from some time in the 1820s. A lovely illustrated book by Mrs. Barbeau from some time in the 1800s, Evenings at Home. And The True Mystery, a book from that amorphous second millennium of the Common Era. And you're right in noticing that this example asks brackets, but it was too good to omit. And now, to be sure, I don't mean to poke fun unfairly at my dear colleagues at Cambridge. This is most likely a vestigial record, a type that every library has in its catalog. And I could show you records from the Yale Library catalog that would have you scratching your head, including a few that I wrote. So how do talented professionals and amateurs decide to supply deficiencies and rectify mistakes? The short answer is that catalogers or bibliographers make a context-informed best guess that ties an item to a specific date or within a span of dates, often by employing reference works that give historical markers and context. One very helpful database I use in my work was created by the librarians at the American Antiquarian Society. The 19th Century American Children's Book Trade Directory, a fabulous resource, where one can find likely date ranges based on a publisher's address. We see here as an example, the prolific publisher based in New Haven, Connecticut, Sidney Babcock and Successors. Or you might find information in the books themselves, such as lists of other books available from a publisher, as in this book, A Pronunciation, Peter Piper's Practical Principles of Plain and Perfect Pronunciation. I've read it many times. Here are some nice examples of detective work by Cambridge University Library catalogers and curators using helpful resources and clues. Daddy Darwin's Dovecote, A Country Tale by Juliana Horatia Ewing, which may well be from 1884, owing to publication dates supplied by the National Union Catalog pre-1956 imprints and the British Museum in the notes field. This map block puzzle is from around 1890, according to the dealer who sold the item. So yes, librarians sometimes do trust dealer data. This edition of William Hazlitt's Essays on the Principle of Human Action is from 1836, as attested by John Maynard Keynes, who owned the book. And if you can't trust Keynes on Hazlitt, who can you trust? Now, a couple of hands-on examples using items from the CUL. Here is this charming Parents and Tutors First Catechism of the Dawnings of Juvenile Knowledge by Margaret Pelham, which features a lovely component, a clock with movable hands, and uses a familiar question and answer format to educate young minds. But also, I would show you on the cover there, but the title page, no date is to be found. But inside, we go to the lesson page, and on page 10, we learn about ciphers. At the bottom section of this book, we read, question, how is the date of the present year expressed? Answer, 1,820, which by taking away the ciphers is written 1820, and so on with the other numbers. Aren't we all so clever? Those of you with good eyes will have noted that this little book also contains a section titled Engravings Representing the Accidents of Children. This is a particular interest of mine, not because I'm a cruel person, but because this type of book of accidents as a narrative form intended for children was one of the most often reprinted genres in the early modern era. Viz. This undated, third chapter of accidents and remarkable events containing caution and instruction for children, well loved and well used. It recounts sensational stories of escape from danger and failed attempts to escape from danger. Yikes. And wildlife in India, which gives one the impression that 100% of threats to life and limb in the 19th century came from large members of the genus Panthera. But look more closely at the words below the last image, and we see, published May 15, 1802, by William Darton and Joseph Harvey, London, a date hiding in the details. And we have a bonus. At the end of the book, we have an owner's note. Marianne Gooch, December 6th, 1804. We thank you, Marianne, wherever you are, for writing in your book. Now we have a list of symbols, abbreviations, and conventions, and evidence of work from catalogers and bibliographers who worked diligently to figure out these dates. But we are still faced with our core challenge: is how do we search for an absence? How do we construct a query that will produce usable results, since databases are not usually well programmed to find spaces, dashes, ellipses, and brackets? The answer in this case, for my work, from this question, following 2 years of long discussions with programmers, librarians, and metadata experts, do it manually. Old-fashioned analog counting. Okay, so then what did I count? I spent a lot of time searching and browsing in the catalogs of both AAS and CUL to learn how publication dates were recorded and gain a sense of what level of diligence was done by catalogers in providing dates. Because different institutions, even though they follow the same type of cataloging rules, have a choice of applying them with some variations and also across different types of genres of material. So the first bit of clarity this work provided was what I would be looking for were instances of supplied dates, as I said. That is, where a date had been added by a cataloger through research or externally derived data. Supplied dates, even if in doubt, even if they include a dash where a number might be, provide enough precision, because they actually have other symbols there that can be indexed, for an electronic system to be able to sort that date into a discoverable population with others. So I was able to use digital searches to narrow down dates by decade and then do the final comparative counts manually, one by one, looking at each date and see which ones actually had doubtful dates. This is why brackets are so important. They indicate the nature of the data, that it has been supplied. The first group here shows examples of dates I counted on the slide right here. Supplied dates that indicate that the book does not provide a publication date as part of its title, verso, colophon, etc., 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 etc. And common bibliographic notations, however, such as ND or SD, would not be of use because they would not be discoverable nor be reliably narrowed to a data set, at least in sort of the work that was done by people at the different libraries. I also skipped supplied date ranges for which the weight was outside the decade I was searching. So I would find something that actually was bracketed, that would actually have like 1833 dash, circa, between, but I would leave out things that had no date whatsoever, or if I was counting for like 1930s, if it was weighted in the 1820s, I left it out. So I had to make some sort of like general sort of, prejudicial selections when I was actually seeing the dates of these things. And I tried not to apply anything that I knew about, oh, this is a date. I just wanted to see what did the library itself ascribe to a certain book. So we will see examples of what was and what was not counted. A much better and truly robust population for a study of dates would be books drawn from a physical shelving location that ties them to an accession period, so we can analyze them in hand book by book. So for example, there are libraries that catalog books as they come in, and they actually give them like a year date. And that would be something where you could actually go there, look at them physically, and have like a much more robust idea of what has the information and doesn't. I was actually doing sort of this one step outside, so that's another limitation that we have to keep in mind. You'll see me back here when I get a grant to do that project, to spend a year in the copyright deposit department. So let's now look at the numbers that came out of this. To remind us of the parameters I used, in the first repository, the American Antiquarian Society, the catalog terms that I found actually were most useful to draw out the books from the subpopulation were juvenile literature or children conduct of life. This took a lot of looking to figure out that those were two very broad subject areas and genre areas that AAS used to mean this is a book intended for children to be primary reading on it, okay? And for the control group, adult fiction, I used the word novel. That was very, very sort of standard across libraries and I compared with several other libraries to make sure that novel was something that 19th century was a very good thing that caught it either in the title or caught it in a catalog reference like novels, readership or something like that. For the Cambridge University Library, juvenile literature as a phrase in any subject field, so here was a little bit more fungible, but juvenile literature appeared more commonly and more frequently in anything for juveniles. And for adult fiction, the keyword novel also worked. And again, the decades, 1800, 1830, 1860. Here we go. This is the first chart showing the results for the American Antiquarian Society. Between 1800 and 1809, of the juvenile literature hits, 576 books counted with 61 undated meant that 10.6% did not actually have a date and had to have a date supplied. For novels between the same years, 1800, 1809, in a population of 72 titles, 5 were undated, which equals 7%, okay? We jump up to the 1830s. The juvenile books in this period of 927 titles, 238 were undated, which equaled 25.7%. For novels, every single one was dated for that period, so 0. 1860 to 1869, for juvenile books, basically 46.8% by the gray bar were undated. However, here's something that actually sort of shocked me. For the same period, 1860, 1869, in a population of 497 novels, 261 weren't dated, which actually gave a whopping 52.5%. Okay, so I'm starting to think, was I wrong? Is this actually something that happens across all genres? Or maybe there's at least another genre? This was an interesting find. My assumption, after doing some looking, especially also at Beinecke's collection, which are rich in 19th century books, is that most of this group of undated books of fiction in the 1860s are dime novels. If you don't know dime novels, they're things like Joe the Sarpent by Edward Sylvester Ellis, the author of Long-Legged Joe, Rattlesnake Dick, and the Imps of the Prairie, or the other bestseller, The Scout of Long Island, or Absconder the Trapper, by L. Augustus Jones, author of The Rollicking Rangers, The Wild Scout of the Mountain, Lightfoot the Scout, Snaky Snodgrass, and The Fatal Marksman, etc. The reason I call out these examples is that we can keep them in mind for later, so just keep in mind dime novels, okay? So now here we are at Blessed Cambridge University Library. The numbers are a bit different. For 1800, only 18.5% of the books, basically 49 out of 265, were undated. Thus, they had supplied dates. For novels of the same period, only 3% were undated. We jump to the 1830s. Juveniles go up to 23.1% without dates. Novels are only 1%. And then 1860, this sort of problematic period in the US, for juveniles in the UK, 50.9%, so roughly half, or 379 out of 744 books, did not actually have dates as provided in their publication process. And for novels, it was a little bit higher, but only 7.9% or 7.8%. So it appears that our English cousins did not have to suffer the folly of pulp novel mania that was raging in the States in 1860. So you see, I'm actually trying to find something, I'm trying to make a thesis, but then now I have another phenomena that creeps into this, right? So does this actually take me off course, or does it help prove things? Well, as I said, this is not the sort of overall complete analysis. It's trying to actually get a picture. And I'm seeing that, in fact, over time, juvenile books, more and more of them actually lack a provided date. Now on to the why. Why do significant percentages of some samples lack dates, and why do they increase over time, at least in these two comparative populations? But it's important to start by asking the opposite question. Why do books have dates in general? A couple of reasons why books have dates. First, very importantly, copyright statement requirements. This is a big difference between the US and the UK. In the United States, beginning in 1802, as part of a process to secure copyright, a written notice was required to actually appear printed in a book, following a prescribed format that was changed slightly several times over the following 100 years. So there's actually, you can see the text of it. This was prescribed as you must have this somewhere in your book. That is actually the piece that actually will allow us to say that there's a copyright in this. In the UK, in the 19th century, as it remains to this day, there's no requirement that a statement appear in a printed work in order to secure copyright, or that it be registered. That is, in the UK, copyright simply inures or subsists in a published work. There's another thing that happens whether there are copyright deposit libraries, and that actually gives them a solid basis to say it was actually received by this library, and it's something that's provable, but it's nothing where actually you have to require a date to be appeared in a book to actually claim copyright. Another reason that books have dates, custom. And items intended for long use tend to carry dates. To memorialize the creation, for being the first to market, for inventory, for distinguishing between like items, sort of almost like an economic or business concern. And then the inherent nature of a work. Calendars, almanacs, diaries often carry dates as just part of their cover or their title or their selling points. Okay, so now we are better prepared to propose reasons books do not have dates. First, though, a few observations drawn from writings on bibliographic process. Joseph Blank, in an essay on problems in the bibliographical description of 19th century American books from an article from 1942, addresses mass production as one of these problems. Quote, "And thus it is that the industrialism of the 19th century, with all its pride in assembly line uniformity, increased rather than decreased the problems of the bibliographer." He gives it as an example, the ability to retain printing plates for reprints due to the changes in technology that may have led to a desire to not add dates to a title page as subsequent editions were published. He cites the juvenile book, Five Little Peppers and How They Grew, first published in 1881, quote, "During the first 15 years of the book's existence, an average of 1,000 copies a week were sold, a total of 1,090,000 copies. He notes that there was a copyright notice in the first edition, but that date was never changed in the plates over 20 years. Thus, one of the most significant successes in children's literature from the 19th century cannot be easily reliably dated." In Blank's later essay from 1955, called A Calendar of Bibliographic Difficulties, he complains that a, quote, "deluge of paperbacks in the late 1890s were issued with false dates to use the lowest possible postal rate." Alexis Whedon's study of Victorian publishing, The Economics of Book Production for a Mass Market, 1836-1916, which came out in 2003, adds another important factor to understanding the production of children's books, detailing the parallel pathways to book ownership in the mid to late 19th century. cheaper editions printed in large quantities to achieve greater market saturation, and more increasingly deluxe versions of titles intended to spur collecting class, all of which did not have reliable dates. Add in the growth of the supply of mass market books in the later half of the 19th century, and the growth of literacy in the United Kingdom from 50 to 60% of the population in the 1830s to 96% of the population in 1900, along with a consolidation of distributed processes for the creation, production, and distribution of books into what we now know as a publishing firm, which could control all of these in-house, and we have the modern world with modern problems, including those of the bibliographic ilk. Additional opinions drawn from the 19th century tend to call out causes of date confusion. Ralph Thomas, our new friend we met yesterday, quoted in the first lecture, who wrote the book on pseudonyms, as Olfar Hamst, published another curious book on book history in 1880, Aggravating Ladies, being a list of works published under the pseudonym of a lady. In the chapter Matters to be Attended to in Cataloging, he asserts, quote, stereotyped books are generally without dates of publication for certain commercial reasons. Only superficial readers are duped by the artifice. Dime novels, remember those? They were printed using stereotype plates. Looking at cataloging guides of this period, we have J. Henry Quinn's Manual of Library Cataloging, first published in 1899. He observes that dating fiction is, quote, quite useless. Later, quote, for the simple reason that many of the books in this class of literature are so often worn out and then replaced with new copies, which are very seldom of the same dates as those printed in the catalog, and it soon becomes incorrect in this respect. Happily, it is a matter of no importance, as very few fiction readers are concerned about the date of publication, and therefore it may be safely omitted from all entries. Quinn may have been echoing the thoughts of Fred B. Perkins, a California librarian who authored a manual for the San Francisco Free Public Library in 1884, in which we find the instructions, quote, sensational fiction needs no notes. Usually, indeed, it illustrates, if anything, what did not and does not happen. There is an increasing public opinion in favor of excluding such fiction from public libraries, and vicious fiction should be excluded, public opinion or not. So he's advocating that you don't even have to actually give them any credence or catalog them. In the expanded edition of this manual in 1933, and yes, we're going past the 19th century, but I think this is worth noting, Quinn adds a comment to about recording dates for children's literature. Quote, unquote, the dates of publication need not be given for storybooks. This links to the view that adult popular fiction need not be dated, perhaps because works of pure imagination do not belong to history or to a place in time. More recently, but addressing the same topic, Patrick Kearney's introduction to his listing of the ARC erotica collection of Cambridge University Library, compiled in 2015, observes, quote, I quickly found an edition of Restif de Le Breton's outstandingly obscene L'Anti Justine, dated 1798. I suspected strongly that the Cambridge edition was a later reprint, falsely predated, as is often the custom with pornographers. These are all anecdotal observations attempting to explain lack of dates. While working on this lecture, I had conversations with many colleagues. I always made sure to ask them to give me their opinion on reasons for lack of dates in certain types of books. The most helpful responses were offered by catalogers. As soon as I mentioned my subject, lack of dates, even if they were not able to provide a solid explanation, they would easily give examples of other genres. For example, one longtime colleague didn't hesitate a second when he suggested, oh yes, juvenile literature has this in common with maps. In his experience, early modern printed maps often did not carry dates, and he added that this could be because dates of production might indicate that they were old and thus no longer useful or accurate. So how to construct a contextual frame to inform a thesis? In keeping with the subject of my first lecture, I want us to think about how a book was intended to function in the world. as a physical object, as an economic object, as an object in time, over time, as a sociological object, as an educational object, as an object of virtue or lack of virtue, an object demarcating class, and there are much more fine revisions, but I think this captures a broad view of what I was finding. So then, we've mined data, we brought it together in chart form, the most exciting form. We've heard from voices old and new, inside and outside the disciplines of librarianship and bibliography. And we are thinking about the various object roles of books. So we can put forth our best guesses as to why 19th century books for juvenile readers steadily lose dates as part of their publication information over time. Here are mine. The possible reasons why 19th century juvenile publications do not have dates. And these are generalized. The recurring publication and fuzziness or laziness of copyright procedures, freshness or churn, and freshness of these books I found in some of the reading was known as the churn, the heavy turnover and constant supply of books for certain audiences. And if you work with children's books or even know about the publishing history, the audiences for juvenile works often function in razor-thin slices, and because the consumer base ages very quickly from one slice to the other. We can see that now. As an example, at the Barnes & Noble Yale bookstore several years ago, I noticed that there were only 2 specifically named sections of books for sale for young readers besides just the general things. There was a section on classics and a section on teen paranormal romance. This is true. But back to the reasons. The remaining 2 are interrelated. The ephemeral nature of book material, along with perception of children's books as an unserious bibliographic category, which also includes a view that fictional narratives may be atemporal in a way. And economics. This is very broad, but very simply put, in the 19th century, children's literature as a market category was maturing in parallel with the changing sociological category of childhood itself. I'm omitting a number of other more specific reasons which may well have played a role, such as piracy, tariffs, and taxation, knowing that there is work to be done to bring together many of these factors because they're all interrelated. But I see these simplified reasons, copyright, churn, ephemera, economics, as indicative of paths to understanding different ways. And I'm sure that there are many of you who have also thought about this issue or similar bibliographic mysteries, so let's put it to a vote. Let's go through this list together, and you can raise your hand if you think that any of these reasons are really a solid part of a viable explanation for missing dates. And yes, you can vote several times like we do in the USA. Copyright. How many people think that copyright might be a really solid reason? Okay, thank you very much. How about the freshness, churn, turnover of things? Okay. The concept of ephemerality, the unseriousness, the treatment of juvenile literature as an ephemeral category that is not really, doesn't benefited by serious bibliographic dating. Okay? Economics in general, that we're all victims of the economy and these books are just materials and there's something that happens there that maybe a date is not important. Oh, a little bit, okay. So, we sort of have like a heavier distribution on the first 3. Economics doesn't make it, but here is what I think personally. I think that, if you can see up here, economics actually has a much larger role. I can go into some more details, but I think that there are decisions about the book that treat it as a product. And in the 19th century, the history of the 19th century is about many things, but one of them is that the supply of materials in our lives became part of a product branding, product distribution, product selling thing. So maybe I'm being a little bit sort of prejudiced toward that. But I also think that the freshness or churn, that you wanted to have a very fresh book. You went to the market or the bookstore and you say, I have a friend with a new baby, ABC book. Well, that's 20 years old. You want to get the brand new thing, right? So there's not a date there. You don't even notice it maybe. So there's not something to actually sort of market in time as new or old, especially whenever the categories change so quickly. But I also think that this more theoretical, kind of more sort of ephemeral type of thought about the unseriousness of children's literature. I find out in the process that the lack of dates in children's books presents a weakness in bringing the genre into a robust historical discussion. Kids' books are assumed to simply exist in an ambient sense, somehow outside of place and time, as generic 19th century books. Maybe I was asking the wrong question. I was applying the core practice of bibliography to a genre of books that may never have been consciously created to stand up to traditional bibliographic analysis. Many forms and genres have remained pretty stable over the long period of the age of movable type. Adult categories of books that are built to hold their own in conversation with standards of bibliography. More mutable items, broadsides, printed ephemera in general, maps, chapbooks, and children's books, may not be able to answer the bibliographic questions we demand of them. I also realized that the question I was asking was one distillation of an overarching issue. The 19th century is a problematic period for bibliography, as Jacob Blank so rightly observed. Everything related to bookmaking, printing, and publication mutated during those 100 years. I don't think this phenomenon is intentional or conspiratorial, nor is it simply a functional failure. If I were pressed to offer something clever and memeable, I might say that bibliography in the 19th century, applied to creations of high virtue or low virtue, was subject to the churn of circumstance. And if there's a key observation I can offer in regards to how we do bibliography, it is that we must remain aware that there is as much evidence in absence as there is in presence. Thank you.